Hi there, I'm Brother Merrill, and this is Sunshine for the Soul Inspirational Stories. I certainly appreciate all of the people listening and the comments. I'm thrilled to have some of the stories people have shared with me and to be able to share inspirational stories. I think we need more inspiration today in the world. There's so much negativity in everything that we're exposed to. I want to tell you a story today about a guy that I would call a spiritual stud. His name is C.V. Spencer. He never held a position in the church of any note, but he served wherever he was called. He was one of those in the last wagon that just namelessly went forward and did whatever the Lord asked him to do and tried to have the courage and the fortitude to do it. He wasn't always perfect, but what an amazing story I have. In the spring of 1850, Brother Spencer got a premonition that he was going to be called on a mission. And he thought, that's crazy. They'll never call me on a mission. I've never even prayed or spoken in church. No one knows who I am. They'll never ask me to go on a mission. And back in those days, they called people on a mission from the pulpit at General Conference. So he thought to himself, the way to do this is I won't go to General Conference. Then they can't call me on a mission because I won't be there. And that was fine until the last day of conference. He just could not stay away. And so he went down to the old Adobe Tabernacle and was milling around outside the last session. And when there was a little time left in the meeting, he decided that he couldn't hear very well, and he decided to just crack the door open a little and listen. And the first thing he heard was, "It is moved and seconded that we call C.V. Spencer to serve a mission in the European mission." And he turned like he was shot and wandered down Main Street, and he thought, who would call me on a mission? They don't even know who I am. This is crazy. How would they even know my name? And then a little voice in the back of his mind said, the Lord knows your name. He called you on this mission. And so he accepted the call. And he, along with 6 other elders, was set apart by President Heber C. Kimball. And in his blessing, he was told that he should go forth as Peter of old and declare the gospel in foreign lands. So he, with the other elders, left on April 19th from Salt Lake City. There'd been a heavy winter that year, and as they tried to cross Big and Little Mountain, the snow was extremely deep. He said they cut a pole 27.5 feet long and plunged it down into the snow and couldn't hit the bottom. They were wading in snow up to their necks. At times, they had to let the animals go and let them trail along while they tried to push the wagons. Some days they only made a half a mile of progress a day. They had made runners out of limbs and tied them across the wheels of the wagons. But they finally got to the other side of the mountains and began to make some progress. They reached Platte River on May 25th. And they decided as a group that they would sell the oxen and the heavy wagons, and they'd get 2 light wagons with 2 teams of horses for each wagon. And they'd pack it with all the food they could hold, and they'd make some good time. And so they did. And by July 4th, they were in Council Bluffs. And there was a huge crowd there, so they were able to negotiate the sale of their rigs for much more than they would have ever gotten for oxen and heavy wagons. After they sold their rigs, the elders all began to move across the states towards Albany. And one at a time, the elders would excuse themselves and detour to go see family or friends in a nearby area that they were at. So by the time Brother Spencer got to Albany, he was alone. And he said as he walked into town, he felt like he was on display. He was tired and dusty and dirty. His fur hat had been abused to the point that he said it only had a couple of hairs left. Looked like a skin cap. And people were looking at him like he was an alien or something. And he just kept walking through town, and he came up to a steamer. And when he went to board the steamer, they stopped him. And they said, you can't come on here. And because of the way he looked, they wouldn't let him on the ship. And so he turned kind of discouraged. He's already discouraged. He thought, I'm just going to go to my homeland in Massachusetts. I still own property there. I know people. I have friends and family. I'm just going to retire from this. This is crazy. But as he stood there, he turned and he looked at the ship, and it said U.S. Mail. And he realized that they had mentioned that the ship had been contracted by the federal and state government to move tourists and citizens. And so he went back and insisted that they sell him a ticket. But by the time he got on the ship, he had had enough of the people. Everybody was looking at him like he was from outer space. And so he grabbed a chair and he put it right in the bow of the ship. And as the steamer started to move, he just thought, I'm just going to sit here and be by myself. And pretty soon a voice behind him said, nice evening. He just ignored it. And he says, boy, the boat's making good time, isn't it, son? And again, he thought, if I ignore him, maybe he'll go away. And then the man said, have you come a long ways? And he finally had had enough, and he turned around and he snapped at the guy, and he said, yes, I've come a long ways. I've come from Salt Lake, and I'm going to England. Is there anything else you want? And the man stepped back. He was a little shocked, and he and his friends looked at him curiously, and then he said, yes. If you're from Salt Lake, there's a lot of things we want, because the news was full of misinformation, like it is today. And rumors about the Mormons and what was going on in Salt Lake were rampant, and people were talking about it. And they wanted to know the truth. They wanted to talk to somebody from Salt Lake. So they said, why don't you come to dinner with us? He said, he was in a bad mood, and he said, I'm not eating. I don't feel like eating. So they went and had dinner, and a little while later they came back, and they said, listen, we've talked to the captain, and he's agreed to let us use a large cabin, and there's a lot of people who would like to hear you preach. And he goes, I don't preach. They looked at him and said, well, why are you going to England? He said, to preach. And they said, well, why won't you preach to us? He goes, I don't want to preach. He says, I've never preached. I don't want to preach. And they said, well, will you answer some questions for us? And so finally he agreed to answer some questions. He made his way into the room, and every seat was full. And there were people standing around the edges of the room and in the aisles, and he made his way to the front of the room. And on his way through the room, he saw a large, dark-eyed, dark-haired man. And he said to himself, there stands the devil himself. And he answered several questions, and the meeting had quite an amiable spirit. And then all of a sudden, this dark-haired man's kind of pushed to the center of the room, and he started to give him superficial comments like, you're certainly a fine-looking gentleman. Elder Spencer kind of glanced down at himself, all dirty and bedraggled, and he knew right away this guy was shining him on. So, and the guy continued to lather him with compliments, and then he said, you must excuse me, my young friend. After you have given such a testimony of the goodness of your people, could you explain why? And then he listed there were half a dozen men that had come to Salt Lake and then left, and they had filled the press with testimony, supposedly, of how terrible the Mormons were and how they would kill any Gentiles that came, and they had all these wild tales. And he said, why were those good men not able to live peaceably among your people? And Elder Spencer looked at him and he said, because they were gamblers and whoremasters and black-legged villains like you. And the man just became enraged, and he started to rush towards him with his hands out. The crowd grabbed him, and as they were pushing him out the door, they pounded him on the back and said, if God Almighty had come down out of heaven, he couldn't have told your character any more perfectly than that little Mormon. And they had a great meeting, and at the end of the meeting, they had collected $300, which is a lot of money back then, to help him on his mission. And he said, I can't take that money. He said, we go without purse or script. And so he got 3 of the men to agree to each give $100 to the poor in their community the next winter. When he got to New York, he was joined by the rest of the elders that were going to go on the trip with him. And they left New York on August 15th, and they arrived 30 days later in Liverpool. When he got to the mission, Orson Pratt was the mission president, and he assigned him to go to the Colchester area. When the branch president heard of his assignment, he said, that's an impossible city. He said, unless you have the power to resurrect the dead, you'll never get a convert, because none of the citizens are going to listen to you. And so he worked in the town for several days, and he had absolutely no success. And there was a community a little over 30 miles away, and he decided he'd make his way to that community. He felt impressed to go there. So the first day, he walked 20 miles on an empty stomach through the mud and the rain, and there was a little inn on the side of the road, and he stopped, and he had 1 penny, and he negotiated with the innkeeper for rabbit stew. And he thought it sounded so good. He always liked rabbit. And the lady brought him out a little crust of bread and some moldy cheese, and he could hardly eat any of it. And so he just went to bed, and he got up the next day on an empty stomach and walked 12 miles. And as he was approaching the town he had determined to go to, he saw a woman, and she was packing 2 buckets of water. And when she saw him, she ran up to him and said, I knew you would come. I saw it in a dream. Come to my house. I have a room fixed and clean for you. And so he went and stayed with this family, and within a few days they were converted to the gospel, and they became the first fruits of his mission. He received a call to travel with Elder Jacob Gates, and they were traveling through the area and talking with people and trying to find converts, and were not having a lot of success. It was a rainy season. They were going towards their place one night, and there was a little herbalist shop off to the side, and he felt impressed to go in there. He only had 1 penny in his pocket. He told his companion, I need to go in that shop. So he went in and he bought an herb that he thought would make him feel better. While he was in there, he started to talk with the owner, George Goddard. George was eventually converted. He moved to Utah, and he served in a variety of callings in the church, in the Sunday school, and he was an assistant to George Q. Cannon. So he became a staunch member of the church. And it was just because this elder had the feeling he should go into that store for a moment. A few days later, he got a new assignment from F.D. Richards, the new mission president. And he had been called to be the district president of Norwich. And he thought, I can't be a district president. I could never do that job. I'm not capable of doing that. And he spent a couple of days moping around and complaining to himself and thinking, I don't know who would call me to that. And then he got another telegram from the mission president. And it chided him and said, are you going to sit around and whine, or are you going to get up and be a man and fill your calling? And so right at that moment, he answered the call. And he went home to get his things. And the wash lady had just washed all his clothes and was hanging him on a line. And so he packed all his clothes in his carpet bag wet. And then he made his way towards Norwich. And he stopped at the branch president's house. And the branch president had several missionaries there, and he's trying to enlist one of the missionaries to go with him. But the branch president didn't help. He said, you can't go to Norwich. That place is crazy. They'll kill you. He said that they hate Mormons in Norwich. He said, we've had people go through there, and it's a violent community, and you'll never have any success there. If you're going to Norwich, I wash my hands of the situation, and your blood will be on your own head. And he tried to get one of the other elders to go with him, and finally convinced the youngest elder in the group to go. And so they made their way to Norwich, and they rented a hall for a meeting, and they were making their way around town, posting bills and announcing to people their meeting. But as they started, pretty soon a gang of kids started to follow them, and they were throwing dried chunks of manure and coal and handfuls of mud and anything they could get their hands on at the elders. And Elder Gates, after a while, he looked at Elder Spencer and he said, "I quit. This is stupid." And he left. But Elder Spencer had booked this hall and called a meeting. They had bills all over town announcing it, so he went to the meeting. When he got there, there was a huge mob. The building was full, the building was surrounded, and he pushed his way into the building, and when he stepped into the building, he was hit in the side of the head by a huge pile of peat, and it knocked him to the ground. And he got up, and he was fishing the dirt out of his eyes and his ears, and he looked around, and the hall was completely full. He made his way to the front of the building and got up on the stand, and he didn't know what to say. And finally a scripture came to his mind, and he said, "God hath made of one blood all nations of men that dwell on earth." And then he looked around the congregation, which was full of Methodists, and he said, "The Methodists were persecuted and driven and harassed when they began. They could hardly get a foothold, and they would be driven out of communities. How would the founders of your faith feel if they saw how you were treating me?" And he said, I've come thousands of miles. I'm by myself. I've left my friends and my family and my loved ones at home. I've come here to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And look how you're treating me." And before long, people were wiping tears off their cheeks. And he said that they had a glorious meeting. And at the end of the meeting, a Methodist rushed forward and began to verbally assault him. And before he was done, they hoisted the minister up, shoved him out of the building, and then a jeering mob followed him home. 4 weeks later, there were 16 members of the Norwich branch, and they began to have huge meetings. The building they met in, they had to take all the windows out of one side and build a big deck because there were so many people they couldn't even fit in the building. They arranged for a meeting, and he thought, "I'm bringing in a couple of ringers for this meeting." He brought Elder Harmon and Elder Wallace to the meeting. And when they got to the meeting, it was full, and it was not a friendly crowd. Elder Wallace got up first, and he could only talk about 2 minutes before he was booed off the stand. Elder Harmon got up, and before he'd spoken just over a minute, this big blacksmith stood up and he said, "Shut your head." So Elder Wallace gave up. And at this point, Elder Spencer knelt down with his back to the crowd, and he told the Lord, "I'll do whatever you want me to do, but please inspire me, help me know what I need to do." And he turned around and he had the craziest thought. And he said, "How many of you have ever heard a minister sing a comic song? Would you like to hear a minister sing a crazy song?" And so he sang this crazy song to all of them. After he finished singing, he had their attention, and they were quiet. And he said, "You know, when Englishmen come to America, we would never treat them the way you're treating me." He said, "We try to be gentlemen. And I thought in England there were gentlemen." And this quieted the Englishmen down, and they listened to him. And he spoke for an hour and a half. At the end of the meeting, there were 17 shillings donated to pay for the rental of the hall for the meeting. And so he had won over this group. And the branch began to grow very, very quickly. And soon the ministers in the area formed a secret anti-Mormon organization. And they were distributing handbills, and they were having meetings and talking to people. And they were gaining momentum, and they decided to rent the largest hall in town. And at the time, it was the third nicest hall in all of England. And the meeting was very well publicized. And Elder Spencer heard of the meeting and decided, "I need to go to that meeting." And when he got there, there were over 2,000 people, and they were not friendly to Mormons. He pushed his way into the building, and he looked around, surveyed for an empty seat. There was not an empty seat in the congregation. And back in the very top of the stand, in the choir section, there were 3 empty seats. So he pushed his way to the front. The meeting had started at 2 o'clock, And by the time he got there, it was 5 o'clock. And at 8:30, the minister that was there said, if any member of the unfortunate Mormon church is present who has the hardihood and moral courage to attempt a defense after such an overwhelming exposure of your system as you have heard here today, he would be welcome to come speak. And then every eye in the building turned and looked at Elder Spencer. And the priests on either side of him stood up and blocked him in. They would not let him out. And he stood there and he said a silent prayer. He opened his eyes. He could see the stand right in front of him, the pulpit right there. And so he had the impulse. He grabbed the heads of the two priests in front of him, pushed them to the side, stepped onto their chairs, grabbed the next two priests, and in that fashion made his way to the pulpit. And he said he doesn't remember anything he said in the meeting, but he had everyone's attention, and the Spirit of the Lord was with him. And at the end of the speech, this is what he said. You are infidels, and it is you who make infidels, and by your precepts smother the hope of any realization of the gifts and blessings promised by Christ and his apostles. I prophesy, moreover, to you in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ, that your labors of this day and night shall be the cause of hundreds embracing the gospel that I teach in this town. When he finished, he made his way over to the stairs that led up to the pulpit, and his way was blocked by the congregation. And one of the ministers got up and decided he would refute what he had said. And he had a Book of Mormon, and he tried to read it, but he was shaking so violently he couldn't even read it. Another minister came and tapped him on the shoulder, and he let him speak. And he just uttered gibberish. No one could understand him. And by that time, it was obvious to Elder Spencer that he needed to get out of there. And he turned, and his way was blocked in. He said it looked like every human being there was a devil. And someone yelled, "Get him! Take him! Tear him limb from limb! Where is he?" And he was standing right there on the stand. But no one in the congregation could see him. And then one large man from the back of the building with a large cloak looked directly at him and pushed his way through the crowd. And when he got to him, he said, "Be still, and I will save you." And then he wrapped him in his cloak. He put his arms under his arms and wrapped him in front of him with the cloak over him, and he carried him through the crowd. None of them knew he was there. He walked through the mob that was surrounding the building. He walked over a block down the street to his own home. He opened the gate and tossed Elder Spencer in, he said, like a piece of wood. And then he said, "I'll be back." And about an hour later, he came back with a group of members from the LDS congregation. And they surrounded the building and kept him safe for the night. And the next day, he procured a bundle of the finest publications they had for the church in that area and presented it to this man. And he asked him, "Why did you do that?" And he said, "Because it was the right thing to do." After that, the LDS chapel was full every week. It was overflowing. They baptized every week. When Elder Spencer left Norwich, there were 1,059 members of the branch, and 95 of them returned home to Zion with him to Utah. And when he wrote this account, he said that more than 1,200 members of the church now lived in Utah that had come from that Norwich branch. Elder Spencer always answered the call. He served 5 missions. He crossed the plains multiple times as a captain for immigrants. He went and rescued one of the handcart companies that needed assistance. And yet he never held any position in the church, but he always answered the call of the Lord. He knew that the Lord supports those that will follow him. And he'll support you in your righteous endeavors. We live at a time when things are just getting crazier by the day. You wonder about the world and our country, and one thing you don't have to wonder about is that the kingdom of God will roll forth and fill the earth, and that the Lord will support those who follow him, his true followers. If you wonder, is God there? Or if you wonder, does God love me? I want you to become acquainted with the Lord. Quiet your mind. Turn off the TV and the computer. Spend some time in your own head. Think deeply of what you want to be, where you want to go in your life. This life is a fleeting moment in eternity. And if you will kneel down and ask the Lord, do you love me? He will pour his love into your soul. And you can feel the hand of the Lord guide and direct you in all your endeavors. I hope you've enjoyed this story today. You can subscribe to Sunshine for the Soul here. If you enjoyed this story, you'll probably enjoy this one. You could listen to all the stories here. Thanks again for listening.